All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. This is a first, I think, at ACSA. Oh, let me introduce myself. I'm sorry. My name is Edgar Sasueta. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Government Relations here at ACSA. And as I was saying, this is a first for our organization. Typically, some of you may have tuned in to our May Revise reaction, where we had the day of the May Revise being released. We got on a webinar and we got good feedback. So we thought that here, given the situation being so fluid, that it was warranted here now that we had a budget deal. And because the situation has changed so much since May, when we last talked to our members about the budget, that it was prudent to get back on the line and just try to give you the latest information. A couple of the caveats is that we are operating while we had access to a lot of this information, and our team, I'm very privileged to work with our excellent team of advocates and support staff and government relations, and we've been working the lines literally up until a minute before this, getting the latest information. We also give the caveat that some of the situation is evolving. We're going to talk to you about some issues that are still fluid in terms of what the net effect of that is, and what it means for you in terms of implementation. I know we'll get deep into that, and we'll let you know where there needs to be more work or where we're going to need to dig in a little bit more to give them more clarity. One plug right off the bat that I'll give is that our team has been working hard on an analysis, a breakdown of all these components of the budget. And our plan is to get that out to our membership here shortly. I think within the next day, we will have that, and it'll serve as a good summary of all these issues. In a second, I'm going to hand it off to our team here, and you'll hear from a number of them to go through different sections of the presentation. But before that, I just wanted to give some context. And I think I alluded to this in terms of just saying how much the situation has changed. And I think it's warranted for us to start with the positive, that the world that we're living in today in terms of the fiscal situation from the state perspective is a better one than we were seeing in May Revise. If you remember, at the May Revise, we were talking about 10% cuts to local control funding formula. We were talking about 50% cuts to all of the categorical programs like adult ed and CTE, and a number of other nutrition services, our ACES programs that our members rely on, but more importantly, programs that our students rely on. Proud to say that not just because of our advocacy, but importantly, your advocacy, and many of you met that charge to contact your policymakers, send in letters, contact them over social media, and we saw how a lot of our members were willing to take that task. And because of that, I do think that the policymakers did acknowledge that what they were asking us to do there in terms of the governor's May Revise was not viable, it was impossible to ask our folks to do more than you've ever had in terms of opening up schools in the midst of a pandemic with less resources. And so we're proud to say that many of those cuts have been taken off the table. The categorical proposed reductions have been restored. So it's positive news on that end. We are going to see some relief in PERS and STIR, special ed money, and you'll hear some of these highlights from our team. With that said, this is where we also have to give a reality check. I know that if I take a poll right now of the participants of this webinar, nobody is going to say that you have enough resources to serve your students, and because that's a reality. We were hurting in the state when it came to school finance, to school budgets before COVID-19, and the situation that we've encountered over the last months has only made matters worse. So one of the things that we've been pushing really hard against is even the reference from the state that somehow this budget, quote, holds us harmless, because there's a lot of harm that has been done, right? Not only to our students, but to our ability and your ability to do the work that's necessary. So we take issue with the notion of a hold harmless. This budget is better, but by no means it is an ideal budget in terms of what you need to fully serve your students. And that's something we will continue to be fighting for. There's other components of the budget, and I'm already seeing a little bit on the chat, that there's some components here that I think are gonna cause some heartache in terms of restrictions that the state is putting on you in terms of how to manage your staff. and your personnel issues that we fought really hard against. I know we'll spend a good amount of time talking about distance learning and the parameters under which you can do distance learning. And we'll try to clarify some of that. So the work is not done by no means. It's a positive step as a whole. There's more good than bad here. But I think acknowledging and continuing to educate the legislature that we need more support, that we need more resources. A lot of our attention is going to turn to the federal front, given so much of that is contingent on that. With that said, I'm going to pause and I'm going to hand it over to Ivan Carrillo, who's been one of our legislative advocates and been doing a lot of the heavy lifting in his advocacy and his representation for ACSA and for our members over the last number of months. And he has so much respect to you that he, I think, was the only one who actually wore a tie for you today. So we all felt bad because he dressed up and we came without a tie. But in all seriousness, Ivan, I'm really proud to have Ivan on the team. He's been leading our charge on the budget advocacy efforts, and he'll lead us through the first part of our presentation.
Thanks, Edgar. Good to be with you all this evening. If we can go to the next slide, please. Appreciate the opening. Going to provide just a little bit of opening context before we jump in, and then all the advocates will provide further details. But just in terms of big picture, you all knew that our state's economy had been impacted significantly by COVID-19, and there were going to be some tough decisions that the state was going to have to make. $54 billion shortfall. And so with that said, education, K-12 education, was largely spared from any cuts. And so we knew that the governor had proposed significant cuts back in May. That was certainly the worst case scenario. And what ultimately ended up coming out of this is a much more heavy reliance on deferrals. And so we know deferrals put challenges on districts as well to be able to cover costs and come up with cash flow. But there is a heavy reliance on deferrals, and we'll speak to that in more detail here in a minute. But I think that certainly there were some creative approaches that the state also made to provide some cost pressure relief to some of these areas that we've heard from the field and that we know are causing the biggest cost pressures: pensions, special ed, to name a few. And then we'll also talk about that there were some flexibilities. There was certainly some response to the fact that you all made it very clear that given the economic situation, that a number of local flexibilities were going to be needed. And so we appreciate those and applaud those, but at the same time, we recognize they didn't go far enough. And the state is also tying your hands in some respects as well with some local decision making as well. And then lastly, we knew this was coming because there was a lot of conversation around what instruction is going to look like, what's going to be required in terms of hybrid and distance learning, required for student engagement. And so some parameters on those items were set forth as well. And just lastly, I'll say that this conversation around next year's budget is certainly not going to end with Friday's vote and with the governor's signature. Being that we won't have the full revenue picture until into the fall, being that we won't know for some time whether or not, potentially some time, whether or not the feds will pass another relief package, there are certainly going to be adjustments made to the budget into the fall. And we'll be certainly engaged in those conversations on your behalf and keep you updated on those. So with that said, if we can quickly go to the next page, we don't need to spend much time here, but these are going to be the topics that we cover in some detail, and certainly welcome questions and opinions on any of these items or on any items you don't happen to see here. So let's go to the next slide, please. So in terms of LCFF and K-12 categoricals, funding is maintained at 2019-2020 levels. And so there are the cuts that were put forth, again, were not included, that the governor had put forth in the budget that was adopted. And this was the biggest area of separation. We were successful in having the legislature put forth a COLA, but unfortunately a COLA was not included in the budget. So funding levels for the LCFF will be maintained at 2019-20 levels. And that applies for the categoricals as well. We were very vocal in our opposition to those proposed cuts, particularly adult education and CTE. So we're really happy to see that those cuts ultimately ended up being restored. But as Edgar mentioned, we recognize that this does not hold you all harmless. We recognize that you were already underfunded. We recognize that there's more cost pressures than ever given COVID. So next slide, please. And again, since there were no cuts, the state is putting forth a significant amount of deferrals. And so this begins immediately. There's going to be a $1.85 billion deferral for June of 1920 that will be paid in July the next month. And then additionally, there's more than $9 billion in extra deferrals that will come in 2020, 2021. And so this represents the full apportionment amount for March, April, May, and June, and a partial, it represents a partial apportion amount for February. It should be noted that that more than $5 billion of these deferrals will be triggered off if the sufficient amount of federal funding comes in. So again, as Edgar mentioned, our focus is certainly there as well, and will continue to be to make sure that the feds provide further relief monies. And the way that the triggering off of the deferrals will work is that they'll begin by the deferrals that come first. So February will be deferred off first, and then March, and then if there are monies available, it will lead into the later months. And there also is an exemption for LEAs that would experience financial hardship given the deferrals, and that is through an application process with the Superintendent of Public Instruction. Can we go to the next page, please? In terms of federal funding, I think it's important to recognize that this is one of those areas that the state, I think, stepped up and provided support to K-12 education, particularly as it pertains to the $4.4 billion for learning loss. These aren't monies that had to go to K-12 education. The state had discretion on how they were going to use those funds. But the governor and the legislature felt strongly that these monies did come with some conditions, and that was that the monies be spent to address learning loss. So with that said, there are a number of different allowable expenditures that can be used to address learning loss, but the $4.4 billion is for that purpose. $2.9 billion of the $4.4 billion will go out based on supplemental and concentration grant funding amounts. This was something that we pushed for. We actually wanted it to go out based on just LCFF, total LCFF allocation, but it ended up landing on being based on a supplemental and concentration grant funding amount. And then the remaining $1.5 billion of the 4.4 will go out based on special ed enrollment. The $2.9 billion, I'll just quickly note that money does have to be spent by December 30th of this year. And then you'll see here on the PowerPoint that there are additional federal funds that will go out to LEAs as well that are largely discretionary. And so if you can go to the next page, please. Pension obligations, this is an area that there wasn't any change from earlier proposals, so won't spend a lot of time here, but it's redirecting monies that were gonna buy down the long-term liabilities to provide short-term relief. So $2.3 billion is the amount, and it'll provide about a 2% reduction in employer contribution rates for the coming two fiscal years. And with that said, I'll hand it over to Derek.
Thank you, Yvonne. I'm going to move to the next slide, which is about ADA and calculating that. Yvonne used the phrase, I think in quotation marks earlier, hold harmless for this budget. And there actually is one area that for most districts will be a hold harmless because most districts are experiencing declining enrollment and are having these issues with attendance counting right now. So for purposes of attendance counting, the ADA for 2020-2021 will be based on your 1920 ADA at the second principal apportionment period. So that's going to be from July 1st, 2019 to February 29th, 2020. And like I said, again, hold harmless in quotes here because some districts are experiencing enrollment growth. We saw this in the comments or the Q&A earlier. We're going to be working on this one because it's not just some of the online charters and other folks who are out there, but regular old school districts. It's everybody. You can go up, down, and so we're hearing from you all right now about the need to look into whether we're going to account for actual enrollment growth. But I know that this was a point of contention during the deliberation, so we'll hopefully have more to report on this in the future. On the next slide, we're going to look at instructional minutes and days. This is a big issue for districts as you're transitioning to online enrollment and you're doing, distance learning. One of the big challenges is, of course, that the old way of attendance counting doesn't really work, right? Are the kids in the seat during the 240 minutes or instructional minutes of that day? Check the box, you get the ADA for that student. That doesn't work anymore if we're moving to distance learning. So in this case, how are you going to calculate the instructional minutes for the student once they've logged in? It's not going to be whether they were in the seat. It's going to be based on the time value of the assignments as determined by the certificated employee. And then that number gets certified by a district employee. So again, it's not how many classes were they in, it's the time value of the assignments. And that's an assessment that each instructor, certificated instructor, is going to have to make. It's really important to note that, and this is the first point right here, distance learning can be used to satisfy the minimum school day minutes and instructional days per year. And just to help clear things up, they got rid of PE and got rid of the annual minutes requirements for the coming year. So hopefully that'll help out districts and just clear the path for more distance learning, which was the intent here. Important to note that the minute requirements apply to everybody except for non-classroom based charter schools or non-classroom based schools in general. So that's one thing to note, and that is in the language as well. I'm going to move now to probably where we'll spend a little bit more of my time, which is on distance learning. So the deal that was struck by the legislature and the governor was really specific in the sense that they're going to allow distance learning, but frankly, there was a lot of skepticism about districts, and this is not coming from the legislative side quite so much, districts going full distance learning without making the attempt to bring kids back into the classroom, which was a priority for this administration. For sure. Think about the economic recovery and parents and everything going on, as well as instructional quality. So districts are going to be allowed to go to distance learning or hybrid instruction model, but there are some guardrails that were put in place as part of the overall compromise. Guardrail number one is you can offer individual students the opportunity to do distance learning if they are medically fragile or would be put at risk by in-person instruction, or who are self-quarantining because of exposure to COVID-19. And now that seems like a pretty narrow list, right? Because it sounds like it's just for people who are going to be medically at risk. We've confirmed with every party that's negotiated this final budget that the intent was if a student wants to quarantine themselves out of potential exposure to COVID-19, the schools can allow that. So nobody's being forced back into the classroom. And at the same time, districts can also go, and this is the second way they can access distance learning, on a school-wide or LEA-wide basis. And the only criteria here is that it's based on guidance from a public health officer. So districts are going to need to work really closely with their public health departments. What the state was afraid of is a district saying on its own, we have no cases here, but we really just prefer to go online. That's an extreme example. So they do want you to have a public health basis for moving your entire campus online. And I have no doubt that the little pings I'm getting here are from questions on this. So once I finish this section, we'll circle back and maybe Edgar can help me out with any of the questions that we're getting a little additional context. Okay, so last thing to mention on distance learning is we do have new requirements that are necessary in order to get your ADA for these kids. The first are operational requirements, and then the second are instructional. I'm not going to go through all the instructional requirements. You can see it at 43503, which is the Education Code section being amended in AB 77, 43503. It would be nothing surprising to you, but I do want to talk about the operational requirements, and there are three. One is daily and weekly documentation of pupil participation. Number two is re-engagement strategies for pupils with excessive absences, so tracking down those kids and figuring out how to get them to log in. And number three is meals for pupils who are eligible for free and reduced price meals. So three really important criteria there. If a district can meet that plus the instructional, then they can move online or distance learning to, really the extent that they want to based on some of the guardrails that have been put in place. So let me pause there and check in with Edgar before.
Yeah, Derek, no, I think you did a nice job of describing that. And so we'll acknowledge, and I know a lot of time has been spent on this language, and I think we've gotten some of the parties that negotiated this deal to acknowledge that it's confusing. They can tell you legislative intent. Sometimes you read this with their own bare eyes, and folks have been concerned about what is our ability to offer distance learning. I think as Derek stated, and I think it's the most important piece here, is that the basic premise, that the default that the policymakers were coming from, is that they want in-person instruction to be the default. That's what they would prefer. That because of the issue with loss of learning, because what they saw in maybe some concerns of what happened this spring, that they want the default to be in-person instruction. With that said, there is the ability to offer distance learning if you make the case under these requirements. I know the question about hybrid has come up a lot already. And we spent all afternoon working with the parties, and they may have to clarify this. And I think there's us and some of our other statewide partners are going to ask them to be a little bit more clear here, because we're already seeing it around the state. As for a hybrid model, which a lot of folks are planning for that, given that the county health order or the state health order, the California Department of Public Health and CD came out with some similar language, but the one that came from the governor's office was California Department of Public Health asks you to minimize the number of students on campus. So in order for you to minimize the number of students on campus, some of you have to go to a hybrid model, right? Some of you have to limit the amount of students that are coming to campus each day. So for that reason, per the criteria that Derek just talked about, then that's your ability to provide hybrid learning or a hybrid model, I should say. I know there's a lot of questions on that, and we're going to continue to try to address that. So far from clear, but I think these couple pieces, and I know we've gotten also the question about what about these families? I think all of our LEAs have been doing surveys of some kind to ask how many parents actually want to come back to school. And it was our understanding that at some point there was some consideration for an explicit exemption there to say for a family that just simply doesn't want to go back to school, that you can offer distance learning. I think as part of the negotiations that was stricken, but that, as we've been told, the intent there is that those families that choose not to come back, that you would offer them distance learning through this authority under quarantining. As Derek said, the case would have to be made for that they're quarantining due to the potential exposure to COVID. Derek, do you have anything else, or we could move on in the presentation?
I was just going to suggest that we move on, and we'll do our best to answer the questions in the Q&A because I see some follow-ups on this item.
All right, so the budget provides some short-term flexibilities. This includes state pension payments on behalf of LEAs are excluded from the RRMA calculation. It also allows LEAs to interfund borrow for the next 2 fiscal years. You can only borrow up to 85% of the funds, and it has to be repaid back in the same fiscal year or the following fiscal year if the funds are borrowed in the last 120 days. Borrowing of the funds is also contingent on a public hearing. Surplus, the budget also allows proceeds from sale of surplus LEA facilities to be used for one-time general fund purposes. This option will only be available until July 1st, 2024. It also clarifies that LEAs can use SB 117 funds for schools and school meals and distance learning. Josh, if you can do the next slide, please. So there's some updates on the ElCap. The budget eliminates the ElCap requirement for the 2020-21 school year. Instead, you'll have to adopt and replace the ElCap will be a learning continuity and attendance plan. This will include information on student participation and attendance reporting, device accessibility, and instruction. The plan will require stakeholder engagement and must be adopted by September 30th, 2020. CDE and SBE will create a template for the plan by August 1st, 2020. So you don't have to do this from scratch. Edgar, would you like to add anything else about the ElCap?
I think the piece here is, I think we have to acknowledge on one end, you are not going to have the LCAP requirement as it was initially stated under the executive order. But I think it's acknowledging that this continuity of learning plan is going to be a lift for our folks, and especially under this tight time frame. I mean, I think that is a pretty aggressive time frame. This came as a bit of a surprise in terms of them putting that in. I think if we would have, having districts set out their plan, I think that is reasonable. Now, having it being done by September 30th, I think given the challenges that you folks are going to face just starting school, I think is going to be aggressive. But I think as Diana stated, the intent here is not just what you're providing there at that moment in time. We've gotten the question in the last day, what if I'm not providing distance learning and I'm just staying full in-person instruction? This plan would still be required because the state wants to know what is the plan for either if a student gets exposure to COVID and they now have to be given some other form of instruction, or if the COVID rates spike or your local county health office works with you to close down schools, what are you going to do in that case? So that's kind of the intent of this plan that is going to replace essentially the LCAP for this fiscal year.
Great, and I'm going to hand it off to Jason now.
In terms of school nutrition, this budget appropriates $112.2 million in one-time federal elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds for the LEA school meal reimbursements during the summer break, as well as the COVID school closure. That's defined as March 2020 to August 2020. That reimbursement rate is 75 cents per meal. It allows state reimbursement funds from 2019-20 to be used for disaster relief for the LEAs who do not attempt to serve student meals during the school closure period. This is closely tied with the federal piece. We appreciate the USDA's approval of California's pandemic EBT plan and the extension of critical flexibilities, such as the May 15th nationwide extension of the non-congregate waiver, the parent pickup waiver, and the mealtime waiver. That goes through August 31st. We're seeking to get that flexibility extended through September 30th, just as the summer ends. This is another critical issue we're following closely, and that's all on school nutrition. I'll hand it off to Laura.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the budget always has a little bit of surprises for us when it comes to our employment and employee relations issues. And this year was no exception. We found out last week that there was a move to exempt all employees from termination for the 2020-2021 school year. Ultimately, a couple of things happened. One, and we were asked this repeatedly, are we going to be able to use the August layoff window to lay off certificated employees? And we have been advising that no, it probably wouldn't be allowed because history has shown that that has typically been waived, and we have not been able to use that window. So again, in this budget, it prohibits us from using the August window for termination of our certificated employees, except you still can lay off your certificated employees that have an administrative or supervisor credential. So your administrators could still be included in that piece. As far as your classified employees go, the budget was ultimately limited to just 3 areas where you can't lay off, whether it's probation or permanent, and that's in your nutrition, transportation, and custodial services. And I saw through some of the chats about, what's the definition in any of those categories, and they are not outlined in the budget. So my guesstimate is that you're going to be negotiating this probably locally of who qualifies, but the purpose is to ensure the safety of our students and make sure the safety of our schools. So to the extent that that helps you in any way, we'll go forward. But a question was, does a gardener apply to the custodial? Unless you have that person in your custodial services now, I don't see how they would, but you may want to bring them into your custodial services, so you could, currently do that also. There is an additional comment that was added last night. The first drop of the budget was on the 22nd. Last night was additional language that was added that is legislative intent, and the legislative intent is for school districts not to lay off any classified employee, probation or permanent, for the next year, for 2020, 2021. You can still release an employee for cause for both a permanent and a probationary employee. But I want to iterate that this is intent language only, and even though in the language it says should, in legislative circles, that does not mean shall. So it is a statement that the legislature thinks that, we are getting full funding, in air quotes, and that the budget isn't as bad as we had hoped, and so therefore we would not be laying off our employees. But I want to reiterate that it is intent only, and it has a should, not a shall. We'll go to the next one. Next slide. So one highlight in the budget is an increase in special ed funding. And the governor had one proposal in the May revise. The legislature responded, and ultimately it was the legislature's response that became part of the budget. And that is for equalization of special ed. And everybody's going to get moved up to $625 per ADA. And those districts that were above that will be held harmless, will stay at that level. It's for the 2019-20 level, and I know that that's, again, as what Derek said earlier, may cause issues, but that is a stable year that I think the legislature and finance and everybody are using, because it's really the last numbers that they can hold on to. So everybody will get moved up to 625 ADA, and then $100 million has been allocated for low incidence. So many districts are very concerned, whether you're small or large or in between, about those students, the low incidence that have a high cost. So there's a $100 million pool that's being created to be able to access to help you offset those resources, or those impacts of the financial needs of those students. With that, I think we're moving back to Edgar. Is that you?
There were a number of questions regarding the federal funds that are being provided, so wanted to answer some of them. So first off, to clarify, yes, $2.9 billion of the learning loss funds would have to be spent by December 30th of this year. The additional $1.5 billion, the allowable expenditure date runs through September 30th of next year, of 2021. And the students that generate those monies we have not seen any language in the budget bill that restricts your spending of these dollars to the students that generate them, that they would be largely flexible as long as they address learning loss. Additionally, in terms of, it's our understanding that these funds can be used to reimburse costs that you've already incurred, potentially that on learning loss, because it has an allowable expenditure date that dates back to early March.
Yvonne, another question. We got a couple in regards to Laura's update on the layoffs. Somebody asked a question about how districts should deal with the layoffs if they've already noticed the employees, given the classified. I know this is
So this is a big one, and we don't have a concrete answer yet. We are working on it, just so you know, and we'll hopefully have some answers for you soon. In looking at it, if you've already issued the layoff notices and they're effective before July 1st or on July 1st, we think you can go ahead and be able to move through with that because it's for the 2020-2021 school year. So technically those layoffs would have occurred in the 2019-2020 school year. If you're not issuing them until after July 1st, then you're going to be impacted. But we think a couple things. We think that, and again, it's think, and we are working with lawyers to try to really get it clarified because we're going around and having a lot of conversations and playing different scenarios. But we want to make sure that, that you're able to do what you need to do to help you with your budget, and also recognizing the need to maintain the support staff that we need. So we think that if your 60-day layoff occurs and it doesn't happen until August 1st, then I'm concerned that you will not be allowed to let them go. So that's the answer. We don't have an answer. I mean, that's a question we don't have an answer to, and we're working on it. And there's going to be several of them that are that way, unfortunately, that we're just trying to navigate because it really did just come out. So we're trying to figure out how to play every scenario out for you.
On the same subject, Laura, we got a question about not filling vacancies. Would that be considered a layoff? And
I don't think so.
Yeah.
One of the things that I know a lot of our members tell us is it's like with their certificated employees, a lot of districts, not all, but a lot are able to handle the reduction of, or the need for reduction of certificated staff through attrition, if they're retiring or whatever. The same will go if you don't have a job that you don't have a position for, no, you don't have to fill it. But this is for people who are currently working in your schools, who are in a probationary or permanent status in that position, in those three categories. Again, nutrition, transportation, and custodial.
And one more question in terms of the intent, just to clarify, and I think you stated that, but I think that's worth reminding folks in terms of the intent language. Just to clarify, if you stated again, the three categories for classified are which ones, and that there is language on intent, and there will be our labor partners who will probably point to that intent. But if you could just one more time state what
Sure.
the practical impact is.
And Edgar's exactly right. I think where the pressure is going to come is that the legislative intent says you should not lay off any of your classified workers. And so I can envision that when you're at your local level, the unions are going to show that to your classified unions and say, look, the legislature intended for you not to lay us off. It is not binding. Legislative intent is not binding. It will make your discussions probably more challenging, but it does not require you to comply, except in those three areas we go back to: custodial, nutrition, and transportation. And then again, another confusion and questions we're getting is who is categorized in each of those categories. Well, that's going to be a local collectively bargained decision of where you've categorized your employees.
We'll go one more question on this subject. I know this is going to be a topic of conversation for some time, but we'll try to get some interesting question here about whether a reduction in time, so a 20% reduction in time, would that be considered a layoff?
We don't think so. You're going to have to negotiate it. So if you can get the negotiations, because one of the things that we were talking about in the last few days when this language came about was districts, if you're required to have to hold on to, at the time we thought it was going to be all of our employees, then you're only going to be able to pay them, half time. But the reality is you have to negotiate that. And with the timelines in collective bargaining, you probably wouldn't get a resolution till close to the end of the school year anyway. So it's not going to buy you a whole lot of time. But yeah, that's not a layoff, but it is a reduction in their salary. But you have to negotiate it.
Derek, let's go back to, we answered some of these on the chat, but I think worth citing for everybody. Again, the questions on distance learning. So just to clarify, folks are asking about a lot of questions about the hybrid approach. And I know I spoke to that. I'll give you another chance to kind of speak on that. If somebody is citing a county health order, I will remind everybody that we're all under a statewide order and there's statewide guidance to reduce the number of students. What our best thinking on that, in order that would be justification to do distance learning as part of a hybrid model. Derek, if you just want to touch on that one more time.
I agree with you. So yeah, it might be disconcerting to some folks to hear that there are limitations on when you can offer distance learning. But if you take a look at the actual limitations, we're pretty confident that every district and every parent will be able to find their own way in this. So for example, the example that Edgar just mentioned, maybe your local public health officer has not expressly said, you need to shut down all the schools and do distance learning. Well, there are statewide guidances from CDPH and CDE saying that it may be appropriate given your local circumstances, and it is a local decision, as they emphasize, to use a hybrid model or an everybody is doing distance learning model. So I think that the way that they've written it does have guardrails, but putting my lawyer hat, and you all have good school lawyers that you work with, most of them will be able to figure out a way to help you get where you want to go. And so that's my hopefully reassurance at this point in time based on the intent of the legislature and the words on the page.
A good question we got also from Jessica here about the instructional minutes. So for practical purposes, they're waived, but the statute does read that you achieve your instructional minutes you can through a combination of in-person and distance learning, but what they're not saying is that you need to do the equivalent number of synchronous instruction versus while at distance learning. So do you want to speak to that, Derek, about the distinction there, or how they say you meet those pieces within that place?
Sure, and this is really important to note because it's not a blanket waiver for instructional minutes. The only waiver in this Budget Act pertains to the annual number of minutes that you have to meet. The important thing to focus on is the other two issues that they're talking about in terms of minutes, which are your school day minimum minutes, so the number of minutes in a school day, and the minimum number of instructional minutes per year. Those stay in place. You still have to have your school day minutes, and you still have to have your days per year. The big flexibility here is how you meet that. And it doesn't require butts and seats, as they say. It can be done through distance learning as well, or any form of hybrid education that you want to do. So that's the flexibility there.
Yeah, thank you, Derek, for that clarification. And another piece that's worth noting in the language, which is a departure, obviously, I think what we saw in the spring, the state is pivoting, that they want to see distance learning a little bit different than what we saw. And one of those distinctions is by making some references that there should be daily interaction with students, that on a daily basis, there should be some kind of connection, whether that be direct instruction or the equivalent to project or whatnot. And I think what they're trying to get at that is some of the narratives. And frankly, this was some of the conversation to give credit to our own ACSA task force, where I think our folks saw some of the inequities in the system, that one third grade classroom could look very different than others, or even in some other settings, that some teachers were doing full-on Zooms on a very regular basis, where in some other classrooms, they were getting just packets or checking in on a Google Classroom. So there's language about a higher expectation about what interaction. Doesn't mean that there needs to be direct instruction on a daily basis, but that there needs to be a connection with the students. And that was something that we feel, at least from our perspective at ACSA, that could be something that could be beneficial in terms of your negotiations and your conversations with our labor partners. on that front. So that.
Hey, Edgar, can I answer a related question here real quick, which is about, I've seen a lot in the chat box about where do we find all of these requirements that I mentioned about what are the new distance learning requirements?
Yep.
I'm going to put a link in the chat box and then also in the Q&A and some of the answers there, but I'll just say it right now. AB 77 is the bill that the legislature is going to send to the governor, and that's our part of the budget here for education. We're going to want to look at two different code sections. That's 43503 and 43504. And I'm going to put that in the chat and in the Q&A so that you all have it. You can take a closer look. I sort of condensed them. It's laid out in a typical legal fashion, a lot more words in there, but you can take a look for yourselves.
Yvonne, we saw a couple questions about ADA, and we've heard about this in the last couple of days about the ADA hold harmless and the potential impact to districts or LEAs that could be growing. So do you want to give any update on that? I know there's been a lot of activity here in the last 24 hours on that front.
Yeah, we're certainly mindful and well aware, and we've been beating the drum in the state capitol about the fact that ADA hold harmless does not account for the growth that some districts are experiencing. So we've been in contact with policymakers and with members of the Education Coalition, and it certainly will be part of our advocacy for additional changes that will follow the adoption of this budget. But in terms of what will be voted on Friday, the ADA hold harmless essentially it provides protection to declining enrollment districts only, again, because it does not capture the growth that some districts are experiencing. But this will certainly be top of mind and a high priority for us on the advocacy front moving forward.
On the continuity of learning plan, Diana, just to clarify the date, make sure we have that right, that right now as it stands there, it's a September 30th date, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And some folks made the good point, as was stated in our comments, that is a very aggressive timeline, and I think it's fair. I think somebody had the suggestion that ACSA could maybe help give a reality check to the policymakers about that could be quite a task. So we will take that suggestion and communicate that and work to see if there's not some flexibility on that front, given that this is a new requirement there. Let me see, just going real quick off of the questions. I'll let anybody have anything jump in that I have missed. Oh, Yvonne, I'm sorry. I was going to ask you this about, there's some questions about, and I know you touched on it, got another question, so I'll ask you to just touch on it one more time about the timelines for expending the federal funds. I know you talked about that, so just quickly reiterate that.
December 30th of this year for $2.9 billion that go out. And then the additional $1.5 billion in federal funds will be able to be spent until September of next year, of 2021.
Somebody had a question, I could answer this, clarification on busing students, given social distancing. This is not addressed in the budget, but this is part of the guidelines. Actually, the only guidance that spoke to this was the California Department of Education guidelines. That wasn't a mandate, those were recommendations and considerations. They do suggest that there should be social distancing and limiting the amount of students on buses. Again, that is only guidelines. Those are suggestions, considerations to the extent possible. So take that for whatever it's worth. I know that there's some legitimate concerns there. I know we were hearing from some LEAs, given the reaction to the guidelines about restrictions on making personnel changes, that the demand for busing could change too, as some parents may not feel comfortable utilizing transportation. But so just to reiterate, nothing in the budget about social distancing or guidelines there. The only thing you would find there is the California Department of Education has guidance and the California Department of Public Health has guidance, but I will warn you, the CDPH does not speak very extensively to the busing of students. Looks like we're getting most of the questions. Some of these, we will make a commitment. I know I saw a number of requests that we put this out also in the form of not just the video, but if we could put out the question and answers, we will commit to that. I believe we can do that. So we will send this out in addition to that. Also got confirmation from some of the policymakers this afternoon that the governor's office, in conjunction with the Assembly and the Senate, is working on a FAQ. Some of these questions that you were addressing to us, especially around some of the distance learning, that is going to be a big piece on it. We haven't got the question on one other issue, but I know it's gonna quickly become one of the priorities, is liability. And Laura, do you wanna speak to that?
Sure. So Derek and I are both working on this issue. The issue of liability, obviously, it's a big one for everyone. And we were told that the legislature was trying to push for something in the budget, but the governor's office really wants to look at it more holistically, not just for schools. Of course, we want it just for schools. We are working on legislation on language right now. We have an author, and we will have a bill, and we will have a bill that we hope will move this year. It will just be for school districts or LEAs only. I don't know if that will, again, if the governor is going to want us to do something broader. But we're really going to be pushing for some language that we are currently negotiating with a team of my colleagues to figure out the right way and what we really need. How long do we need the liability relief for? And when does it start? When does it end? And we want to make sure that if a district isn't doing anything, something to be proactive to be safe for your students and employees, that's one thing. But if you're doing everything that you need to be doing to protect your students and your employees based on all the information that you've been given, recognizing that you're not healthcare experts, then we believe that you should be free from liability. So it's not going to be a simple fight. One would think it would be, but it's not. It's going to be one we're going to have to tackle. We're going to need all of your help when the time is right. So we'll keep you posted, but it is front and center on our list to do. And we should have a little bit more clarity by next week on what that looks like.
Not seeing a lot of other questions, and my apologies in advance if we missed yours or we dismissed yours by accident. We will go back and try to answer some of these that we may have not gotten to before we release this to folks. And as I said, just to give a plug to some other work that you will see a summary of the budget here come out from our team in the next 24 hours. And it doesn't end here. As Yvonne talked about, there's still going to be issues to resolve, whether it be the ADA, clarification on the distance learning, a number of issues that may go into August. And as we started this conversation, that you folks were wonderful in terms of just having your voices heard. And, and I think we're always very transparent that there are things in here that we voiced our opinion and our perspective wasn't necessarily the one that prevailed, but I think that shouldn't deter us, because I do see that there was movement here. And on some of these issues, it's going to take some more negotiating. Kind of the thing that I always say, and I think it's sometimes it's a source of pride in terms of the members that we recommend, that you folks always make it work. I think sometimes that is taken for granted, because no matter the resources, no matter the tools that you're given, you folks make it work in terms of running our schools. So we're going to need you in terms of continued advocacy, in terms of just continue to voice what the impact is, what is the challenges that you're facing. There's more flexibilities that may be needed as the health situation evolves. So we ask you to just stay in touch and let us know how else we can help. We will follow up with the presentation, the Q&A. If there's any questions, feel free to contact our advocacy team there. I know somebody can put, Christy, Suzanne can give a contact there if there's any way we can help. Also, just a plug to our website, if you go to ACSA.org, there's a mechanism there to just ask any legislative questions, to give us your thoughts, to put any issues on our radar. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll be in touch. And just thank you for all your continued work and efforts.